Hello, everybody. Great that you are all here. I am standing here in the Pai de Sun, and we are sitting here in this wonderful, wonderful festival. I think more people are sitting here. There is some shade here. Are you sitting comfortable? Yes, okay, great. This is a bit more open. Maybe other people will come as well. A very warm welcome on behalf of Open Estonian Foundation organizing this discussion. And there are so many discussions to choose here in Arvamusfestival. So I understand people are maybe wondering, where should I go? I'm very happy that you are all here taking part in this one. Maybe some people will join during the discussion. We will incorporate them as well. My name is Bart Cosijn. I'm the founder of the Estonian Dialogue Academy, and I will be your moderator for the coming 1.5 hours. Around the world, thousands of elections are organized every year. National elections, elections for presidents, for parliaments, regional elections, local elections for your city, for your town. We have referendums organized. We have, in some countries, elections for public officials. Many, many, many elections. At the same time, as Mari-Liis Jakobson, one of our experts, notes, is that democracy worldwide is in the decline. And still, we organize elections almost everywhere. That brings us to the question that we will discuss in the coming 1.5 hours, is, does voting still matter? Do elections still matter? It's not an easy question. I was walking around talking to a few people. Somebody said, like, I'm very happy I voted for the first time, but I also found it quite scary. I didn't know who to vote for. And another guy said, like, I could elect in my local elections, but not yet in the national elections because I'm still too young. People are very engaged, and still they are sometimes also wondering who to vote for, what does my vote in the end do? Do I have a real influence? How do politicians behave? These questions that we walk around with. We will be talking about it. But before we come there, I have a little question for you first. Would you look around and see if there is somebody next to you, behind you, and have a little chat about your experience in your last election? Just a brief chat, like what motivated you to go to these elections? Maybe say some about how easy or difficult it was for you to make this choice. Or how did it make you feel going to elections and using your voice? So look around. If somebody is sitting a bit further away, you can maybe go and introduce yourself to a person. If you find this a bit scary and say, no, I'd rather just contemplate by myself, that's perfectly fine as well. But I invite you kindly, look for a person around you and chat for just a few minutes about your personal experience with elections. About 1 more minute.
She just said, not the zoo format, but the same fact that it's very diverse.
For the people just joining and wondering why we're sitting here in silence, I asked to have a little chat among each other about your experience with elections, your last elections, your experience, how it was, and so forth. Can I ask you, if it's okay, just briefly, what was your experience with the last time that you went to an election?
Well, it was a good one. I'm always excited to go and express my opinion, and I do my research before.
And how do you do your research?
Well, I read about their program, and also get them on social media and see how do they communicate with their public and so on. And I like to analyze their way of addressing people. Is it like in a friendly way? So on.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Can I ask you, what were you talking about, if that's okay? Is it difficult for you in your... Where are you from, can I ask?
Yes, I'm from Romania, and next year we'll have all the election rounds, even it's for the city mayor, for city councils, mayors, and so on. So it'll be very hard for the people.
So you have to make up your mind several times on one day.
Yes, but not now. It's not sure, but maybe we'll have this in May and in October next year. You need to have some electional education for the people in order to know exactly how they will choose the better candidate. Yes.
And can you imagine, or do you know people around you or friends that find this difficult, so many choices?
It's difficult for the administrative part, and somehow it's difficult because the people are not very prepared for being with an eye of the people and to see if they will do the best things, and also how they have the priorities or maybe what they proposed and if they will put in practice after that.
Thank you. Somebody wants to add here about his or her experience? Yes, I will walk around these chairs. You were thinking by yourself about your own experience?
Yes, I'm from Belarus, and you know what happened in Belarus in 2020? I'd answer the question, does voting matter? I'd say that voting doesn't matter. Observation and checking everything matters, because in Belarus the votes were counted as it was needed.
Yeah. So if there are no fair elections, then voting doesn't matter.
Yes, I believe that I've been an observer on the elections, and I see that this procedure that they have the people who observe the elections, they must have as broad rights as they can. So they should be given these rights to check every bulletin, to prove that everything is okay.
Yeah. And what's your feeling now about democracy in Belarus?
Now, there is no democracy, there is autocracy.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. So we had a few experiences of you with elections, how difficult it can be, what it means if you have elections in a country that doesn't or hardly have any democracy. I have a few second warm-up questions, and you can just answer by raising your hand. It's very simple. Who of you has elected in your last national elections? Many people, yes. And who of you lives in a country that is mostly run by coalition governments, meaning different parties working together? Yeah? And are also here people who live in a country where one party is running the show? There, yeah? If that's okay, I don't want to force you anything with the microphone, but I'm just curious, where are you from?
From the United Kingdom, it tends to be the right-wing Conservative Party, which has absorbed the populist parties there. And I haven't voted since the Brexit vote because I realised that that was all fixed and it was not a genuine vote. And since then, there's no point in democracy in Britain as it's enabled.
And how come that Brexit, this election, has lost your belief, your trust in democracy?
I think that it was just the way that they lied on such a gigantic scale. And it was an election that was fixed for the very rich, who now more or less run Britain. And we're going to have to live with the consequences of the Brexit vote until at least probably 2040. And I'm getting older, and I probably will never see Britain back in the European community. So.
But it could be that the other party, Labour Party, will win the next elections.
They are pledged to remain outside the European community. And there's no immediate prospect for any change in Britain. And it's one of Britain's biggest problems, its inability to change. It looks back on its past, its glorious past of empire, and won't look to the future in the same way that Estonia does. And I now live in Estonia. I feel I'm in an optimistic country with Tulevik. It's got future.
So you're here, and here you're optimistic. Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Who of you says that voting is an obligation for citizens? They should vote. Few people. And who says no, that's the freedom of every citizen to choose whether they should vote or not? Are there, by any chance, people from Belgium or another country where there's an obligation to vote? No? Yeah, kind of. I love Paris. If it's okay for you, can I briefly ask for your perspective here on whether voting should be obliged or not?
I'm not Belgian, but I live there. Yeah. But I do not think it should be obligatory.
Yeah. And why not? You could say democracy is so delicate, we all need to care about it. Let's make it compulsory.
I think people should vote, but it should be because they want to, rather than they have to.
I think many people have the same thought. If you want to add something, please raise your hand. Don't wait for me. A few last questions. Who of you sometimes doubts whether their vote has real influence? Who of you sometimes doubts whether your vote has real influence? Yeah, some people. Yeah, that side. Can I shortly go past you if that's... Otherwise, I'm only standing on the other side and you feel excluded, and that's not very democratic. Why do you sometimes have this doubt?
Mostly because I'm one person, and that there are hundreds of other people with their opinion. So it brings the question: does my vote matter, or does it change everything? Because I'm just one person, and sometimes I feel it matters, but there's such a rare occasion that never happens.
Yeah, thank you. So, not a lot of trust in. Yeah. Thanks. 2 last questions. Who is generally speaking satisfied with the behavior of politicians after elections? Okay, let's turn it around. Who is generally not satisfied with the behavior of politicians after elections? Many hands here. If I can ask one of you two. Why are you not satisfied?
Oh, there are so many reasons. Sorry.
think about what is the first or the most important for you.
Well, where the question why I'm not satisfied, it also involves everything that goes on before we vote. I would like to vote on ideas and the perspectives of how we see the problems of today and the solutions of tomorrow. And I would like to hear real debate about them. But I'm not hearing it. So I'm forced to think about and analyze the personas. And I don't like this trend. I know it's a mega trend internationally. I don't like this trend. And what we see after voting is that the focus goes on negotiating the coalition contract amongst politicians. I'm not seeing or feeling the real concerns being heard during those negotiations. And yeah, that's why.
Thanks a lot. So you would rather vote for subjects or themes instead of people, and then it takes so much time to find out which person is standing for what goal. If you want to add something, please do. Feel free. Then we go to the last question of our kind of warm-up round. These three experts behind me, I will introduce them in a moment. They are here with us to talk about elections and the question, does voting matter, in three specific countries. And we will be talking about Estonia, Hungary, and Turkey. My question to you is, of these three countries, Hungary, Estonia, and Turkey, in which of the countries was the highest turnout in the last national elections? So in which of these three countries did the most percentage of people show up in the last national elections? Who thinks it was Estonia? Most people, you think it was Estonia. 2 people Estonia. 3. Who think that most people came to the last national elections in Turkey? Quite, yeah. About half, 60%, things like that. And who thinks not Estonia, not Turkey, but it is Hungary? The biggest percentage, the highest percentage. A few people about the same, or a little more than Estonia. Okay, let's turn to our experts here. And one note about the way we do this discussion. Please feel free to make comments, to ask questions. Don't wait for me as the moderator. Just wave your hand. We have Jette here who will also be helping. We have an extra microphone. And you don't have to ask like crystal clear questions or very elaborate thoughts. If you just have something that you wonder about, there's something you don't understand, you find strange, or you just have a thought to share based on what we are talking about here together, please do. We will come to you and make sure that you can be part of this interactive discussion. But first, a very warm welcome to our 3 experts here. I will also take a seat for a moment. Helps me with the sun. Left of me here, Mari-Liis Jakobson, very warm welcome. She's Associate Professor of Political Sociology at the Department of Social Sciences at the Tallinn University. And her background is in political communication and citizenship and migration studies. Then we have Peeter Raudsik, also a very warm welcome. Yes, we can applaud. Thank you. Next to her, Peeter Raudsik, also a very warm welcome. He's an expert in the Middle East. He has worked as a diplomat in the Estonian team of the UN Security Council, focusing on various Arab countries, peacekeeping missions, and terrorism. And he's very well informed about the latest political situation in Turkey. And we have Róbert László. Very warm welcome. Róbert László came from Hungary to join us here specifically in this discussion. He's an election expert in the Hungarian electoral system. He works at Political Capital in Budapest. And he's a professor in electoral program at the Budapest University of Public Service. So these are our 3 experts that we will have our joint discussion with. The last question was this knowledge question about the turnout. Mari-Liis, you know Estonia very well, and we're very happy that you're here to join our discussion. What was the percentage in the last national elections in Estonia?
Well, in this ranking, I think Estonia has the honorable third place. So it was around 64%. But I have to say that the method of counting the turnout percentage changed since the last elections. So overall, the actual turnout was a bit higher than last time. So I think this is a positive trend. But yeah, we are clearly trailing behind Hungary and Turkey.
Peeter Raudsik, how was the situation? Last elections in Turkey was both parliament and president?
So the audience was right. Yeah. It seems that democracy works and voting works very well and gives us the right result. So most of you said and thought it was Turkey with the highest turnout. It's true. So in May, during the last elections, in both rounds, the result was over 80%. So a very, very high turnout for any country in the world in Turkey this time.
Okay, thank you. And Róbert László in Hungary, what was the score?
The last election was held in Hungary in 2022, April, and the turnout was around 70%. So we are between the two somewhere.
Okay. And if we look a bit further in the elections in Hungary, how in general did these elections go in your observation?
You mean the last one?
The last one, yeah.
At the national election, it was in Hungary. The 70% is a pretty high percentage when it comes to turnout, and it happened because of the fact that after 12 years of the Orbán regime, we can call it that. Call it that way. It was the first elections when the stakes were pretty high. This was the first time when the oppositional voters perceived that at least they have a chance to win. In 2014, in 2018, everybody knew that it will be another landslide victory for Orbán. But in 2022, at least for a few months, in the end of 2021 or early 2022, people perceived that something changed, something happened. The oppositional parties started cooperating. They held primaries, first time ever in the Hungarian history. They had a joint prime minister candidate. They had 106 joint single-member constituency candidates. So they felt that something is happening and there is a chance. What happened is a slap in the face and the biggest margin of the Orbán victory in 2022. This is why the country is so disillusioned at the moment.
Yeah, and if you hear people here in the audience telling about their experience with elections and then doubting whether their voice has real influence, well, how would you describe the, let's say, the atmosphere among people or young people in Hungary with these elections?
As I mentioned before, these elections, most oppositional voters perceive that at least there is a chance and it's really worth to show up, to turn up and cast their ballots. After 2022, in case we would have an elections next Sunday, that means tomorrow, I can see the chance that less than 50% would turn out. Because at the moment, the opposition is in ruins, and nobody perceives that Orbán can be beatable. Actually, in 2019, we had municipal elections in Hungary, and that was the only elections when the oppositional voters had some kind of success experience. The Budapest Lord Mayor is delegated by a Green Party. After the 23 biggest towns in Hungary, in 10 oppositional candidates win the mayoral position. So at that moment, there was a perception that Orbán is not invincible anymore. And everybody was looking forward to the 2022 national parliamentary elections. Okay, and
so many people, you think, have lost hope in this electoral system.
And this is why it was a big slap in the face, because the previous 2.5 years, pretty much people felt that something can happen, and it wasn't the case in 2022.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for now. If we go to Turkey, can you describe, it was like both national parliamentary elections and elections for the president. What was your impression of these elections this time in Turkey?
So I'd say two things. They were fair elections when it comes to the electoral process. So if you take the days when elections were taking place, how they were counted, how people had access to voting stations and so on and so forth, relatively okay, relatively fair when it comes to the process of the day itself.
Is that as a fact surprising to you?
No, it's not surprising, but I think it's something that we tend to overlook sometimes, and we tend to think that elections as such in Turkey are rigged to a great extent. So this is not true. You had international observers, you had OSCE there, you have incidents, of course, but they were not significant incidents. So fair elections when it comes to the voting days. However, and this is important, when it comes to the campaigning period and what preceded elections, completely unfair. So you have fair elections and you have completely not fair campaigning period.
Meaning that not all the candidates have an equal chance.
Exactly. So the candidates don't have equal chance, but even more so, and I think it's even more relevant, that you have journalists in jail still for writing against President Erdogan and so on. So it's not an equal playing field for different parties, and the candidates don't have the equal access and chance to be on the stage before the elections. So, if you look at freedom of speech level in Turkey, it's been over years declining, and now they're somewhere between Congo and Mexico, so very far from European standards in that matter.
And that then also means that if we want to judge elections on their fairness, we should not only look at the procedure, but the whole process, the campaign, the freedom to debate, to discuss.
Absolutely, but I think it's interesting, and that comes to this very high turnout, that people still place a lot of belief and confidence in the process. So it was quite interesting to hear about Belarus and this point that if you know that this electoral process is rigged, it has lost its meaning. But in Turkey, because the electoral process is relatively fair, people still have a belief that they can change, and they can, that these elections can bring change, and they still go out. So you don't have this, which in some other autocratic countries, you have people kind of pushing or not wanting to deal with power at all, or not wanting to deal with politics. And you see that in the Arab world very much happening. But in Turkey, that's not the case. So people still come out, they still vote, and they believe that their vote actually matters.
Okay. Thanks. Mari-Liis Jakobson, Estonia, you are from Estonia, but you look much broader. Can you tell us a little bit about these last national elections here in Estonia for the parliament? And some of the candidates or politicians also walk around in this festival. What did you observe?
Well, I would say that in many respects it does not really compare with the context of Hungary and Turkey. So Turkey definitely, and I would also say that Hungary is technically a competitive authoritarian regime. So you have elections, which, there is no ballot stuffing or anything like that, but there are clearly unequal grounds for the other candidates to run. And I dare say that this is not that much of a case in Estonia. So we don't have politicians arrested before the elections if they become inconvenient or they are too charismatic or popular, like the mayor of Istanbul did, who faced corruption charges, right when he was about to become the competing candidate for Erdogan. So we don't have that. What I would also say was maybe different this time around is that there was more of this kind of electoral polarization in the air. that kind of, it has a good and a bad effect, right? So it has a good effect because it kind of urges people to go out and vote and have the feeling that we all have this doubt that whether my vote actually counts, right? It's just one vote, but you never know. This is the charm of the game, and you go out to vote just, in order to not be that person because of whom, the people you didn't want to win actually win.
So, one point, sorry that I interrupt you. What do you mean exactly with polarization around subjects, or polarization in another way?
I would say that there wasn't that much of a polarization between subjects, as somebody also from the audience noted. I would rather say that there was a polarization between ideologies or worldviews more generally.
Okay. But then in a good sense, that there is something to choose, or?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So there is definitely something to choose. We don't have, a multi-party system can't be a place where all parties decide that, we are, for Brexit and this is not going to change. Yeah. So it's harder to create like a vacuum in a multi-party system. And I think this is also what kind of flings Estonia up, very high into the top 5 in the World Democracy Index at the moment. So, I think we don't have too much to complain about. But still, there is some kind of disillusionment. I'm relatively worried about the fact that there are people who feel that part of the election is rigged, especially when we talk about the online votes. So this was a big issue which was raised after the election. And I think there is also quite a lot of disillusionment because of the coalition agreement. And it kind of feels that, okay, we have this coalition government system, everything is pretty proportional. And then, the politicians go into the back room and negotiate something between themselves. And
they make a deal, they come out.
Yeah, and a lot of the voters are questioning, is this actually what I voted for? So, you might be an issue voter, but decisions might be made, they're made on a broad scale of programmatic issues. And something might still fit into the mix that you didn't agree to. Yeah. So that's kind of the pain part of democratic decision-making in representative democracies.
Okay, thanks. And if we briefly look at these 3 countries that we are talking about, and what you were explaining about the last national elections, Róbert, about Hungary, explaining, like, in some sense, quite a hopeless situation. But was there something in these last elections that you thought, that was still very interesting? I didn't expect that this would happen. Was it the fact that people were hopeful and in the end Orban won again with a big landslide? Or was there something else that you noticed?
There are plenty of issues about it, but I try to focus on 2 things. That after the 2018 elections, there were 2 lessons that the opposition learned. Number one lesson was that they have to cooperate. Because the Hungarian electoral system, which is notoriously complicated, and I will not go into details, but it's much more complicated than the Estonian one. So it certainly cannot happen that plenty of parties make it into the parliament and then try to find out who will be the coalition partners. It doesn't work because we have a mixed system with 106 single-member constituencies. So they learned that the opposition parties have to cooperate and find their joint candidates and joint prime minister candidate, and to fill their joint party list as well. Yeah. This was lesson number 1, and they learned it, and they did it.
And if we make quickly a connection with Turkey, like there the opposition also worked together, came with one candidate, like happened in Hungary. Was there any resemblance? Does it have to do with the same situation, that there is one party very strongly leading and the others are kind of either forced, or they see that the only way they could be successful is collaboration? Do you think, Peeter, before we go back to Róbert?
I'm not sure, but I think, especially when it comes to the comparison, but in the Turkish case, of course, if you look at the result, you will see that so the first surprising thing relatively surprising, new at least, if not surprising, was the fact that you actually had a second round of presidential elections. That was not the case in the previous times.
Okay.
It actually went to the second round.
Because there was no majority in the first round.
In the first round. So you had the second round, but there Erdogan did win. I mean, a landslide is a big word, but he went in and won in a very confident, secure way. He had more than 5% difference with Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. So that's one part. But I think what is in a way surprising is that the Turkish opposition, especially the CHP, then the National Party, run by Kılıçdaroğlu, and who was the biggest opposition party and smaller opposition parties around him, they still managed to, they failed in getting the Kurdish parties and Kurdish voters behind them. Because in this situation, when the changes of the percentage are so small, the Kurdish voters in Turkish system, they become kind of the kingmakers. And in this case, they did not come out in they did not come out during the second round enough, and that actually meant that Erdogan won. It was not that Erdogan got more votes in the second round, rather the Kurds just fell off, and they did not come behind this Turkish National Party. And what it tells is that the Turkish opposition still haven't succeeded in bringing the Kurds behind them. And this is something, you know, that you can argue that this will be the change maker in the future. When this happens, when the Kurds are going to be behind the Turkish opposition as a whole, they can defeat Erdogan, but not until that.
This collaboration. And in Hungary, what you were telling about the collaboration between the opposition parties?
Yeah, it worked well. This wasn't a problem. They just assumed that in case they will cooperate, all problems are solved. And I forgot to find out what the message was about, how new Hungary would look like without Orbán and with this six-party coalition. And most people simply didn't believe that these six parties could actually lead this country. But I promised two lessons that was learned. It was number one, the duty of the cooperation. The number two is that during the 2018 elections, there was a delusion that the elections were rigged with this very traditional Russian type of election frauds. And this wasn't the case. However, plenty of people believed in that. And as a consequence, the lesson number two was that, okay, next time we have to prevent this, and in all 10,000s of polling stations has to be observed by at least two oppositional candidates, which wasn't the case in 2018. So the whole civil sphere and the oppositional parties worked for one common reason: to train 20,000 Hungarians to delegate them into the 10,000 polling stations. It seemed a very ambitious task in 2018. And actually, this is the success story number two. They managed to do that. There were plenty of volunteers who find their way to even the smallest villages in the country, and there were observations. So everybody assumed after 2018 that these two factors would lead to a victory, because nobody can rig the elections, and there was a cooperation among the oppositional parties. Everybody thought that this will be more than enough, not in case not for a victory, but at least to stop Orbán having a two-thirds majority in parliament. And this didn't happen after the two successful lessons that was learned. So if you ask me whether I have an idea how to defeat Orbán in the upcoming years, I cannot do any forecast after these two lessons that seemed to be successful before 2022 and didn't lead to any kind of success.
Okay, maybe we can elaborate a bit more on that, but it's an important conclusion. Before we continue, does anybody have a thought, a question, something you would like to ask? Something that comes up in your mind? please feel free to do so. It can also just be a rough thought or something you think is different in your experience. Yeah, you. Okay, I thought you were pointing that way. Yes. We will give you a microphone. Yes.
So my question goes to Róbert and Hungary. That you say that there is no hope in the near future for Hungary to make it without Orban, but don't you think that maybe some sanctions or methods by the European Commission should change his policies? Let's say regarding the support funds and so on.
So you
maybe this will work for him to make and to reform the judicial system and so on and so forth.
And do you mean, should the EU save democracy in Hungary?
To just try to influence. And save, so in this way, democracy in Hungary.
Yeah, thank you. Róbert.
First of all, it wasn't me who said that it's no hope. It was you.
Okay.
I just didn't challenge you. As a Hungarian who live in there, and I imagine my future in Hungary, I'm an eternal optimistic. So I don't know how, I don't know when. I'm not brave enough to give you any forecast about it, but all regimes that were planned for thousands of years collapsed after a few decades. So Orban is pretty successful. He's in power for 13 years, and before had another 4 years he was prime minister as well. But he will not make it until he leaves. So, but about the EU, about Biden, I think this is not a good way for Hungarians to trust from the foreign help. It's us Hungarians who have to find out what to do with ourselves and how to defeat Orban in the upcoming years. Obviously, now the EU finally woke up, and after around 10 years of having this deep sleep, thinking that Orban is not relevant and it's just about Hungary. No, it's not. We can see that he's the most famous Hungarian in the whole wide world. He's the role model for all right-wing populist parties around Europe, even in the whole maybe in the whole world, but at least in European countries, he is regarded as a role model and followed by plenty of parties and people. And this.
But if you say that you're hopeful, or you have to keep faith in the system, and Hungary has to solve this by itself first and foremost, is there any role for the European Union or other organizations in safeguarding democracy in Hungary?
Obviously, there is, but the propaganda machine works very, very effectively in Hungary. And whatever happens in the European Parliament, whenever he is interpelled and asks questions in the European Parliament, or anything the European Commission says, for millions of Hungarians, it is filtered by the propaganda machine, and they just consume the news as the way it is beneficial for the government. In Estonia, it's very hard to imagine how effectively this propaganda machine works. And I don't say that there is no freedom of speech in Hungary. Of course there is. I can say anything I want, and there are plenty of media channels, YouTube channels, TV channels, weeklies, and online portals which are still free, and they are performing as independent media still, but they cannot reach out to the critical mass. And a few millions of people in Hungary are simply closed in their opinion bubble, and this is how this work. And I don't expect the European Union to defeat Orban. It's our job to do that.
Very clear. Thanks. Other ideas, comments, questions? Yes, over there.
Here, there.
Yeah.
No.
Yes, we go for. I will just pass through these chairs. Yes, your comment, idea.
Yes, so basically I heard it twice already, maybe 3 times, and it brings me to the thought that who controls the media and the propaganda controls the elections. And it doesn't work whether they're rigged or not, whether the procedure is good or bad or everything. Basically, most of the people go with the propaganda flow, and we have to have the independent media working to have the elections working. So just a thought, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Peter, could you briefly comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, first I wanted to somehow reflect on this trying to interfere from a foreign land in someone's elections. I think Estonians especially, but also others, would be very, very cautious even about talking about it, because it's something very much, you know, it's so easy that this influence, even if you call it with such soft word, can turn against you, because this would immediately become an object of attack by the ruling party, whether it's in Turkish case or I think also maybe in Hungary's case. So in these systems, any foreign interference will backlash, would be my sense. So I'm not sure that this would be a remedy of any sorts.
Yeah, we have to be careful with that, or thinking that this should solve a problem in one country.
The Hungarian opposition politicians are always labeled as foreign agents.
Yeah.
So, and anytime a message comes from America, from the European Commission, and obviously it's against policy issues about the activities of the Hungarian government, it is always commented like they want to tell us what to do in Hungary, and the opposition politicians just labeled as their agents, their puppets, and plenty of people believe that. Obviously, just a minority of Hungarians, but still a massive voter base.
Okay, thanks, Mari-Liis. This trust in the system, and whether not saying that intervention in Estonia would be needed, but how do you observe or see what happens in Turkey and in Hungary from your Estonian perspective?
Well, I just wanted to say that I see that we're already kind of broadening the debate, that democracy is not just about elections. So having elections without ballot stuffing, or having elections where all the candidates are kind of free and treated equally, is one thing. But I think the question about Hungary is also about civil liberties, like between elections, right? And the question about the media as well. So this already kind of takes issues, or makes the issues much more broad. So even if you have like a really, free electoral system, and even if you have like civil rights fully guarded, it does not, protect you fully from, let's say, some kind of media bias, for instance. Even if the media is fully free to do whatever they like and report however they like, this can still kind of happen, which makes the electoral terrain, or makes some people feel that the electoral terrain is unequal. So no one, no country is kind of defended from that, Estonia included.
Yeah, and if we look a bit more specific about, there was also one issue we talked about in the opening, the behavior of politicians before and after elections, or related to that, the expectations that people have when they go and vote. You wrote opinion analysis prior to this discussion, and there was an interesting point you mentioned there in the end, saying that maybe when we have elections, there needs to be some kind of warning message on the electoral, like on the posters, because maybe
results not guaranteed.
Results not guaranteed, or please sign here that you are familiar with all the rules of this game.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, it sounds a bit funny, but how did you come to this conclusion? Do we expect too much from elections, or do we expect the wrong things when we pass our vote?
Well, yeah. I mean, voting is relatively easy, right?
Yeah.
It's not very time-consuming.
You just go and...
Yeah, you just go and fill the ballot.
In Estonia, you don't even go somewhere?
Yeah, you don't even have to. Just log on and, cast your ballot. And, you don't have to take too much, you don't have too many obligations related to that, if you go and vote. So it's relatively easy to do. Maybe that makes us undermine the complexity of democracy a bit. And I've seen quite a lot that in Estonia, I mean, Róbert said that Estonian electoral system is relatively easy, and I agree that it's much more proportional. The amount of votes cast per party is much more in line with the number of mandates that they get out of it later on. But still, the mandates are divided in 3 different rounds, and many people are just, insecure about whether they can make like a logical or a justified decision, that if I vote for a candidate who gets 200 or 300 votes, then they won't get into the parliament, and then my vote is like wasted, and all these kinds of myths circle around. So I think this is the answer is always education, right? That if we understand the complexity and also why the system is complex. Like, why do we have like personal mandates and district mandates, and then later on those weird compensation mandates where the parties decide which candidates are kind of prioritized. If we understood that better, then, maybe the results would also feel like more justified.
Because like every country is very good in making their own system complex. And then citizens have to understand this. There was also one person in the audience saying, I would rather vote for themes or subjects instead of people. And like in some countries, like you vote and then the politician can make up his or her own mind. In other countries, people expect that this politician all the time comes back to him or her to ask, like, what should I do in the next votes? Yeah, Peeter?
Yeah, I was just thinking that in Estonia's case and in countries in our region and so on, the elections are about certain topics and issues and kind of, picking a right path, but you actually know where you're going. So when it comes to Turkey, for example, the stakes are much, much higher, I'd say. And they are higher because they are not electing on whether we want to build or whether we want to get our energy from wind parks or solar parks, basically. I mean, very simplified. There they are fundamentally deciding how their country will work in the future and so on. And it's really about then, for the opposition, it's about defeating this long-stayed enemy who's been in power essentially 20 years in Turkey. And for the ruling party, it's about still keeping that power and maintaining that their ideology will be leading the country. So it's a very fundamental change that these elections are about in Turkey. I'd say more than about this, not nitty-gritty, but it's relatively smaller issues, I'd say.
Yeah, and if we look at the behavior of politicians, I don't know exactly, you know much more about the details, but I was reading that in Turkey, for example, the currency was said to be kept on a relatively stable level before the elections, and after the elections, by policy decisions, it dropped immediately. So this kind of games of maybe also examples in Hungary of how politicians promise us like the whole world and all the solutions, but they can't deliver or they don't want to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think this is the key theme there, or it's not about currency. That would be my point. It's not even about inflation as such.
Yeah.
It's about how we deal with economy and society as a whole.
The whole direction of the country.
The whole broader principles, how the country is being run. And in Turkey's case, you have 52% of people who see that Erdogan knows what he's doing. Yeah. And then you have the rest who are obviously not in an agreement. So, but it's about this fundamental question of how we run our country, what do we really want as a society, what our values actually are, because this religious dimension, we can, we might not want to talk about it, but it's very much there in Turkish case, and we can go into that in a bit. So it's a much deeper discussion, I'd say, and these elections are much more is at stake there than just these questions of currency or certain smaller topics.
If you want to simplify it, now elections in these countries are the matter of death or life. Actually, 20 years ago, when I first started to deal with politics and elections in 2002, there was an elections in Hungary. Actually, the prime minister's name was Viktor Orbán back then. And a few of my American relatives who left Budapest decades before just visited Hungary, and they were really surprised that why do Hungarians hate each other so much? Why is this so polarized campaign? And everybody got crazy. In America, it doesn't really matter. Sometimes we have a Democratic president, sometimes we have a Republican one, but nobody's really interested. And I was really envied that this is the situation in America. Maybe 20 years later, we'll be there somewhere where it doesn't really matter, the outcome of the elections. 20 years passed away. Actually, I feel that the Central Europeans taught the Americans how to hate each other. And now the polarization in America is so high than in Hungary or plenty of Central European countries for decades. Actually, we didn't gravitate to this level of democracy, but taught them, obviously it wasn't Hungary who taught America, so don't take my words by word, but you know what I mean. So this tendency is a global tendency, I guess, but Hungary and Turkey obviously has a very big experience on this polarization, and I really cannot see how this can be changed in the upcoming years.
I should say on the life and death mentioning, and I think it's correct in some cases, and in Turkish case we've actually seen that. So in 2016, when there was a coup attempt in Turkey, the next day after the coup, I happened to be in Istanbul. And, there was a lot of confusion, what is going on, what's going to happen next, and so on and so forth. And I'll just, give you a very small portrait of an Erdogan supporter from the very far end, I'd say. So he's a student, but he's there at that time in 2016, he's there as an exchange student because he's from Turkish descent, but he actually and his family lives in the Netherlands. So he's come back home basically to study, to improve his Turkish, and so on and so forth. But he's a very firm supporter of Erdogan. Then that summer, the coup happens, this attempt happens. Erdogan, of course, rallies a lot of people to come on the streets, to make sure that nothing will happen, to protect the government, and so on. And I meet with him, and we talk, and he tells me he's coming from the Netherlands for the summer to study Turkish, and he tells me that if he would die here on that street, this would be the best day in his family's life, in his life.
Why?
Because he so firmly believes that Erdogan is doing the right thing, and this coup is unfair, and that him on the street is doing the right thing, protecting the ruler.
In the honor of his country.
In the honor of the country, in the honor of the ruling party as well.
Yeah.
So, and he's coming from abroad, essentially, and he's ready to actually go then, what was mentioned, to go there and die, essentially. So, at least in his words. So, this is the level of supporters or thinking that you have there.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
And
Mari-Liis.
actually, I wouldn't say that it's very surprising, because if you look at the election results of like homeland voters or voters who reside abroad and vote in the Turkish elections, then you see that basically Germany and the Netherlands is the powerhouse of Erdogan's support. So this is where they support him the most. And the same goes for the Hungarians who live outside of Hungary in the Carpathian Basin. So not the immigrants, but the people who are of Hungarian origin but live somewhere.
Very different voter base, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and who were enfranchised, about 20 years back, a bit less. This shouldn't be surprising. If you kind of distance yourself from, I think it's a good example, again, of if you distance yourself from information and it's easier to live in kind of a bubble, in a pro-Erdogan bubble in that case, for instance, then it's, easy to have this sentiment or this feeling that you're like in a sports competition where you're supporting your team. You're not, trying to figure out like what is best for my country. You're just there because you're a patriot, right? And this is part of, I think, what Róbert also described, this kind of polarization. And I think polarization is a big issue in many democracies and competitive autocracies as well. But there are at least two types of polarization which we need to kind of be able to distinguish. So one is ideological polarization. This means that parties are becoming more divergent, like ideologically. So we have like actually a broader set to choose from. This means that politics gets a bit more radical as well. It can get. But still, we could say that this, by definition, is healthy for democracy. More people find something that they feel they can choose.
Even if it ends up in just two parties with two opposing ideologies?
Well, then the diversity starts to recede. But this is kind of like the end outcome, which is definitely negative. But the kind of sad part of polarization, and this is in particular what we see in the United States, I don't know how much in Hungary, is effective polarization. And this is the situation where the citizens start to feel that they are part of different camps. And, I have nothing in common with the supporter of the Democratic Party or the supporter of a Republican Party, or I don't want to meet up with my relatives anymore because I know that this uncle or this aunt is the supporter of that party, and, I just want to distance myself from that.
No fighting,
So this is a big issue. And I think that partly the key in kind of overcoming these problems actually lies with the politicians themselves. So we as citizens can only do so much as to go and vote and, show our support for one or the other. But the politicians have to be able to stretch across the aisle to kind of make sure that, okay, we can polarize, we can kind of make the landscape a bit more, diverse, but we need to be able to kind of compromise at some points as well.
But even
this is about politicians who are taking responsibility for really to better the situation. I'm not sure that that's the case there.
Absolutely.
Just wanted to say that the bubble, or talking about these bubbles that people live in, I'm not sure that it's the best description in Turkish case, because a bubble is something you can pop like a but there it's rather about fortresses, so which are very hard to penetrate, and I'm not sure even that a better media strategy or even a bit more open, let's say, media landscape during the campaigning and so on would be what would change really the course or the result in that case, because people are really building, their own fortresses and kind of staying there. So what you really need is kind of something to happen that would really show how inefficient or how corrupt the current system is. And in Turkish case, we had that actually this year, and this was the earthquake that took place in the beginning of the year in the south. This really showed at least some people that, okay, the government is inefficient. They're unable to respond in a good manner, efficient manner. So you actually needed an actual earthquake to reduce Erdogan's support in these areas a bit.
And some observers thought that this would affect the elections in a critical way.
And it didn't at the end it didn't affect at the critical point, but it did affect, and that the fact that there was a second round, you can partly write that on the fact that there was this situation, which was created by nature itself.
Okay, there is one question here, maybe others. I will come to you in a moment, because one aspect that I would like to discuss with you and with us is this. Like this distinction between, on one hand, like high trust in democracy, in the process, and still low trust in politicians. And Mari-Liis, you were saying, like, in safeguarding the system or working across the aisle, these politicians have a very important responsibility. But I will come to you first, and maybe there are other questions. Yes, your first row here.
Thank you so very much. My name is Aivo, and my question is pretty easy. Which party in Turkey would have managed the earthquake in better way? What do you think?
And what do you mean with this question?
The question was, the story was something like that. Erdogan's party didn't manage earthquake quite well. But what about opposition? Do you really think that any other party would have managed the earthquake better way?
But maybe it's a little bit very going into detail, because we cannot expect what would have happened otherwise. But just briefly.
Yeah, I think it's not about the political party A, B, or C.
Yeah.
It's about the political and system and the governance system that has been created over 20 years. And if you would have had some change in that, some new faces and so on, and less corruption, which is a problem in Turkey right now, you could argue that the response would have been better. But it's about the governance rather than the party.
Political party. Okay, clear.
If I can add, I think it's a very good question, because this is often asked, and this is also part of support for Erdogan, because he's managed to, a lot of people feel that their lives have improved during his government, and many people find competitive authoritarianisms effective.
Do people in Hungary believe the same thing?
Absolutely, yeah. But I also have to back Peeter, because we don't know what would have been if this had been a competitive democracy all of this time, and an effective democracy. So in that case, it would have been, perhaps better, because there would have been less corruption, less this kind of construction laws, infringements, and so on. But yeah, it's a hypothetical one.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for your question. We have about 22 minutes. I see somebody here. I will come to you. Sitting next to the prom. It's empty. Okay, I thought.
I'm having a break. Maybe just one thought to add to this discussion just now, which also ties back earlier to how people view politicians. I think another aspect is in democracy, sort of the dirty laundry is out in the open. You can see sort of the messiness of how the governance is done, but that in itself provides some accountability. Whereas in more authoritarian governments, you have sort of conscious, active efforts to portray the government as efficient. This is sort of part of the, I don't know if you're going to call it authoritarian myth, is we don't have this coalition politics back and forth. We have one strong leader who kind of makes things efficient. But it is a myth.
Do you mean then that it's kind of understandable that people like this efficiency and for that reason vote and keep authoritarian leaders in place?
I think it's so. It's a myth of efficiency. We know that corruption is higher in autocracies. So people maybe like it to the extent that they sort of consume the propaganda that the government puts out. And I think for people outside of countries like this is maybe what makes these kinds of regimes attractive, because from the outside you don't experience everyday life. You maybe don't experience sort of the corruption aspects of it. What you do see are these claims of unified, efficient governance, or sort of whatever the propaganda is.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much for your question. Like what Sir is here telling, like the myth of efficiency lures people in still voting for authoritarian leaders. Is this true? What do you think? Hungary or in Turkey, in your observation?
Absolutely true. Efficiency and safety are issues that are very relevant to plenty of people, and open society, liberalism, freedom of speech. They are so hard. It's very, very hard to understand what are these things are about. Sometimes they seem to be important, but finally, most people find their way back to the parties that promise safety and pose themselves as the only answer to the challenges and problems of the country. If we can take a look outside from Turkey or Hungary, the same thing happened in Slovakia, and I'm really curious about the election outcomes in a few months' time, because when Jan Kuciak was murdered and his fiancée too, the whole country exploded. And
these were journalists, right?
Yeah, he was a journalist who was murdered, and the explosion swiped away Róbert Fico and his regime as well. But now, after a few years' time, with a very colorful coalition in government and plenty of scandals among them, most people now feel in Slovakia, the Fico was corrupt and there was plenty of problems with the guy, but at least the country prospered and we had a calm and calculable life. And maybe this will fly back Fico to the top of Slovakia again. We will see. It's much harder there because the Slovakian electoral system is close to the Estonian one, not the Hungarian one. So I'm pretty sure that Fico will not gain an absolute majority, but a relative majority he can, and maybe he will be the old and new prime minister again. This is why.
Yeah, thanks.
Very
briefly, Peeter.
Yeah, the myth on efficiency, I think that's one part, but there's this value component there, this conservative religious component in Turkish case as well, so it's not only about this pragmatic day-to-day economic decisions.
Yeah, it's really about like the essence of the country and the direction.
And the value part would come there.
The voters of Orbán, plenty of them really think that Orbán is the gift from God. And he can be never challenged. No matter what he does, what he says, he's the leader of Hungary as long as he lives. And obviously this is not a majority point of view, but a few hundred thousands of people really believe that.
How do you think in Estonia, the prime minister now, she made a big victory in the last elections?
Absolutely. I just wanted to add that even democracies are not immune to this kind of thinking or belief in leadership. And I think this is part of this like sports politics, we might call it, where you're just rooting for your own team, whether it's, based on this one leader who you put your trust with, or if it's like a party or an ideology, and you just root for your own team without kind of like weighing the alternatives and so on. So this is like very characteristic to democracy as well. And I wouldn't say that it's all bad, because this is like the easiest way how to participate in politics. As we just talked, democracy is difficult and complicated, and not everybody kind of gets the nuances. So yeah, I think it's partly inevitable, but then you have this like backlash situation where you go like, oh, and now, I voted for him or her, but she is not doing what I expected him or her to do, and what this like, right? You don't have this effect if the media is not free, right? If you just get your partisan reporting, which will always tell you why this is the right decision and why we need to carry on with this. But as soon as you get exposed to alternative information, then you have these internal conflicts.
Okay, thanks. And I see you there. I will come to you in a moment, but let me introduce our last team. We have about 15 minutes. Also looking at, let's say, the future of voting, to put it very simple, or the future of our electoral system. Just out of curiosity, in the last election, whoever of you went to an election debate personally or watched it in television? Yeah, some people did. Okay, maybe Can I ask you a brief question about your experience? Why did you watch an election debate?
I knew who I was or what party I was going to vote. I'm an Estonian, right? But I wanted to see how they reflected on what they had been doing in the last 4 years and what were the comments about their previous promises and what's going to happen now. And it was more sort of testing of how they relate to each other and can we sort of forecast what the coalition is going to be. But basically, I'm just interested in it. It's like normal part of being a citizen is following political debates.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah. But if they wouldn't have like given you the security that everything would be okay, maybe you would have voted for another party, like a last check.
Then that other party would have needed to give me a very, very much better sort of not promise, but security that they were going to do it. But it's a small country. We know who the folks are, so we sort of know what they do. It's more the interaction of how they do it, and a few specific topics that I was interested in how they were going to deal with it once in the government.
Okay, thank you. And other people here who say like I feel that before elections there is not enough information given to us, or parties are not like explicit enough about what they want, or the media is not reporting on it. They are, you feel in experience in Estonia. One aspect I also want to discuss with our experts and with you is the impact of misinformation. For example, if we see now in the situation in the United States, we're not like diving very deep into it, but where politicians start to question the legitimacy of the outcome of elections, where people don't respect the process anymore. And Mari-Liis, you wrote an article prior to this, and I was reading the comments to your article, online comments, and many people were in Estonia very worried about the safety of electronic voting. Estonia is very proud of its electronic. I'm an electronic citizen of Estonia. But is it really true that people lose their faith in this process, or is it because of the information bubble or misinformation that we think this is true and it starts to affect the real life? With the example of the US, but also the discussion is here in Estonia, where political parties are questioning the outcome of elections.
Well, in the Estonian case, then we're probably talking about one party in particular, I think, which is EKRE, which has been basically the only party. We talked about diversity, right? About positions. Mm-hmm. The only party who has been kind of against online voting, right? So it has been questioning this type of voting before. So it's part of like their rhetoric and part of their core ideology. So their supporters are familiar with it. Another thing, a technique that EKRE often uses is that they really like push polls. So you make polls online, for instance, where people can participate. But it's, if you poll, the supporters of one party, or in a group where you have like predominantly supporters with one, ideology, then you get like very similar results. And this kind of push polling can also kind of lead to having this sense of, there is unanimity behind my position, or also like news outlets do push polls, and very often there are even claims that there are like orchestrated participations in those push polls. So the supporters all go and vote for like their party, so their support looks proportionally much larger. And so this kind of discrepancy between like the push polls that you're used to, that you see like on a weekly basis, and the election results, where EKRE had a pretty solid support in offline votes, but a pretty small support in online votes, which is unsurprising since they say that this system should not be trusted. Yeah. And then you need to explain this to yourself somehow, right? And the logical explanation is, well, we told you so. These online votes cannot be trusted.
Yeah.
And there you have it. We don't need to say any more.
But would you say then this is kind of a problem for Estonia, or because Estonia is relatively freedom of the press, the situation very different than Hungary and Turkey, that this is a minor thing? It's just part of the media dynamic period.
Well, I mean, the online voting system also has to be open to scrutiny.
Yeah.
And I think we don't really have very broad debate on this topic at the moment. And EKRE actually filed a lawsuit. And what kind of followed wasn't a very broad debate about this. So I think this is not necessarily good. So we perhaps should kind of discuss this a bit more broadly and kind of have a more open investigation to it than it actually kind of received.
Instead of pushing it down, it has to be debated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, clear. There was one question there I want to first go and then ask you. You, yeah, okay. I will quickly run. Yeah. Yes, your question, comment.
Hello. I wanted to follow up a little bit on like the problems with democracy. Robert, you mentioned 20 years ago Hungarians used to look a bit west and say, oh, I wish we had those problems. It doesn't really matter if Republicans are in or if Democrats are in. Like, we wish we had these kind of small problems. And 20 years later, you're like, oh, we don't really want that. And then Mari-Liis, you also mentioned polarization in modern democracies is pretty bad, right? I think democracies kind of incentivize that, and politics incentivizes that, right? You say what you need to do as a politician. I want to get into the next cycle, 4 years, and that's it, right? But countries need 20, 50, 100-year sort of cycles of like, this is what's best for the country. And the later stage democracy we get to, the worse it seems to get. I'm from Australia. I think we're mid-stage. We're not quite as bad as the UK or as the US, where it's really polarized, but it's getting there. Where do we go? What's the next stage? How does democracy evolve beyond this, or do we end up going back and what? Yeah, maybe Mari-Liis, I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Thanks a lot for your question. Yeah. Is democracy dying?
Yeah, let me find my crystal ball. I think I put it somewhere here. Great question. I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry. But I think so sometimes we as political scientists also talk about the waves of democracy, and many authors are kind of saying that right now we are having this authoritarian wave where like the competitive authoritarian regimes are seen as the best because, you know, we have this big leader who is supported. There is, it feels like there's a checks mechanism on that. You know, we can, you know, vote them out if we don't like them, if they're not, you know, effective enough. But yes, then there is the question of whether these leaders are really willing to remain competitive authoritarians who can be voted out. And in many cases, we don't really see that happening. Let's take, I don't know, Venezuela, where you had Hugo Chavez, who I would say was a competitive authoritarian leader. He was a populist, so he really liked to talk to people. He had his broadcasts of where he was answering the questions of ordinary citizens, and he was kind of seen as this protagonist of the, you know, simple people. And, you know, this isn't necessarily bad for democracy. But what happened after he passed away, you had his successor, Nicolas Maduro, who basically has tried to cut down on dissent. And basically you have like a huge wave of immigrants. You have you had like a civil war basically there breaking up and so on. So it's yeah, it depends on the politicians what happens if you know, if you give them that much power.
Okay, thanks. Like, we're slowly coming to the last question, and my last question for you would be starting with the question, does voting still matter, and discussing these like three very like interesting countries and their examples. Are there things that you think that these three countries can learn from each other? If we think about the future of democracy and the future of voting in these three countries. What can Hungary learn from Turkey or from Estonia, do you think, Róbert?
I'm afraid we already learned from Turkey too much. From Estonia, there are plenty of things we should learn. This kind of festival never happened in Hungary. I think the key is it's very simple to do the politician bashing and blame it on the politicians, but actually they are representing us, and they are politicians because of we voted for them. So I think we mentioned the polarization, but the outcome of the polarization is a side effect of the polarization is that many people are very tired of dealing with politics at all, and not thinking about democracy and constitutional court. They just feel that they don't have to do anything about politics at all because they don't have the impact on that. This is what most people feel, and this is the aim of the authoritarian politicians.
But that sounds very worrying.
Yeah, and this is my point. Is I promise to be a little bit optimistic that the authoritarian politicians wants to keep their very dedicated voter base active and to make all others inactive. And if you perceive this, I think what you as average citizen can do is to convince your colleague, your cousin, your neighbor to deal with politics, to read real news. And in case she or he asks you, okay, but what should I read? I'm not sure about the sources. I opened the internet and I'm not sure these are news or fake news or stuff. Let's try to explain them which are the good sources. And this is what worth the time. If you convince people, just one person a week, that it's worth to deal with politics, by the end of the day there will be 1 million more people who will ask questions for the politicians. I always say to my not friends, but people around me who don't understand why I'm dealing with this. This is what I always say. If you and your friend and your husband and your mother would deal more with politics, the corruption will be 10 lower.
Clear.
And I think this is what we can do to make people understand that it matters to be informed.
Thanks a lot. Peter, one lesson that you think that Turkey should learn either from Hungary or from Estonia?
I mean, it will be something related to the fact that you actually have freedom of speech that is, and it's widely respected and held up to, because otherwise there's no room for not only for a debate but for expression of thoughts. And actually, it's something I think that Erdogan's party itself is overlooking because they need to innovate a little bit as well, as they haven't really theorized. And if you go to the literature of political Islam in general, the main problem is that they see the good end, let's say, embraces democracy and embraces elections, but they do not embrace the transition that it might bring. So they embrace it as long as they can win it, but not more. So there needs to be some more broader theoretical discussions actually on how political Islam can be then put together with democracy. And this also needs this freedom of speech, that these ideas can be expressed. And I'm not sure that that's there in Turkey right now.
Okay, so you're not hopeful for people in Turkey who don't believe in it?
When it comes to freedom of speech, but when it comes to elections, they are patient, the opposition is very patient, their fortress is at least as high as that one here. So I'm not worried about that.
Okay, thank you. Mari-Liis, what should be the most important lesson for Estonia? Hearing
from Hungary or Turkey?
Yes.
Oh, I hope we don't.
A warning, maybe.
Yeah, I hope we don't have to learn anything from you guys. But I mean, I think there are several things. Right now, this competitive authoritarianism, or like new despotism as it's sometimes called, is like clearly a trend, and we need to be able to kind of recognize this here in Estonia as well, and recognize its kind of dimensions. And of course, we also have to kind of keep in mind that if we don't deal with politics, then politics deals with us. So that's sort of as a precaution. But I think that we also need to bear in mind that both Erdogan and Orban have been pretty efficient leaders according to some standards. So I think there is also something to be borne in mind that, you don't have issues or problems with democracy as long as you're growing, as long as you're improving. And this is where the kind of the focus of the political elites ought to be as well. And as long as this is happening, there are no problems in Estonia. There are actually less problems also in Hungary or Turkey. Things get really nasty when the economy downturns or you have like a supermassive inflation, because then you can't really be just, showing how efficient you are in dealing with some things that you are dealing with.
The mess has to grow first before can rebuild or...
Well, yes, the goal of governance ought to be to improve the welfare or the well-being, rather, of the populace. And this is, I think, something that we need to kind of bear in mind all the time.
We will close with that. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody here present in participating in this discussion, being so open about your ideas and thoughts. So a big applause for you. Yes. We are in the Arvamusfestival and we are here to discuss with each other. Thanks a lot our experts here, Mari-Liis, Jakobson, Róbert, László, and Peeter, Raudsik, for your contributions. Thanks also for the technicians. They are sitting there in their black tent, but they play a very important role in making sure that this all works, that people at home can follow this. So also a big applause for them, please. And also on behalf of the Open Estonian Foundation, thanks for participating. I wish you a very good continuation of this Arvamusfestival. If you have any questions to our experts, feel free to come and talk with them. And otherwise, we will see you next time and definitely, hopefully, next year. Thank you.